Welcome, everybody. It's really great to be here. We've talked here at Fullerton more than once, and the last time it was a very hot day. In the summer, I remember it was 90 or something like that, so it was very warm. So I had a very warm welcome that day, and but after that, we were happy to chill out, as the saying goes. Anyway, what I'd like to do today is to share with you some new ways of looking at a period that's often misunderstood. We hear words like romantic movement, and I think what we immediately think of when we hear the word romantic, we think of maybe Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, or we might think of pulp magazines with guys with big pecs, or something like that. But that's really a very simple way of looking at it. In the 19th century, when the word was coined by a group of artists, particularly artists and thinkers, particularly German thinkers like Goethe and Schiller, the idea and concept of romanticism was much broader than that. It had deep roots in the imagination. And so the word imagination really came to comprise a number of different important ideas, imaginative ideas, ideas of journey, ideas of conquest. And that's why the title of the talk today is Art Revolution in the Romantic Movement, because it's very much the case that Romanticism was a part of a big movement of which Napoleon, the American Civil War eventually, and a lot of other things that occurred in the 19th century did take place, including the abolition of slavery. One could even argue that in a certain way, the spiritual quest of that era was to eradicate slavery, and there was something so-called romantic about that, but not romantic in the cuddly sense at all, having to do with very important ideas that were given motivation and movement. So I wanted to say that, and throughout the talk I'm going to cite some of the ideas about Romanticism as they evolve, and I'll also give you some data and some facts to support this. But primarily what I'm going to do is be showing you images today, important works of art created during this period, and also give you some snippets of pieces of poetry and other important ideas that help frame the contextual background out of which the talk comes. And on another hand, I want to simply say this. I am here to support OLLI. I love what goes on with OLLI. We've probably completed 20, maybe at least 20 different talks at OLLI throughout California. We've done several here. We've done them at UCI. We've gone to San Marcos, et cetera, Carlsbad, and all of that. And we did a talk yesterday at Carlsbad. And so we are committed to this idea of lifelong learning. Maybe there's something romantic about that in a very good way. But also I want you to know that I'm here on behalf of the Endangered Children's Foundation and the company that published my book on Van Gogh. And I have a copy here. Van Gogh's Untold Journey. We're nearly now practically out of stock. We've been very successful. I'd like to say that because we donate the net proceeds to this book to the Endangered Children's Foundation, and it's a foundation saving the lives of children from being trafficked. And to date, we have affected the lives of probably 60,000 children and continue to do it. So at the end of this talk, my wife, Jeannie, who's in the back, this beautiful lady, sitting way back there by that exit door, she will have books there for you. They're already pre-signed. And she can take your order right on spot. We have a square. We can take any of your credit cards and cash and all that. And you can consider it a donation to the Endangered Children's Foundation. And it is a $40 flat rate. And I simply want you to know that. The book itself sells on Amazon, and as I say, we're nearly out of stock. And my publisher is now talking about another edition of it that will be quite something that we're planning, but it may not be for some time. So if you'd like a copy of this book, it's a beautiful book. It was printed in Bruges. It's full of color reproductions and full quotes from the life and letters of Van Gogh. And I will be talking about Van Gogh in this talk as well. So that's my public service announcement on behalf of Endangered Children's Foundation, something we should all care about a lot. So thank you for listening. Now, let's begin. The painting that I have up on the screen just now is that of an orphan. The title of it is Young Orphan in the Cemetery, painted in 1824 by Eugene Delacroix, who is an artist who has often been considered a romantic painter. But when you think about the title and you think about the date of this picture, you suddenly realize that what you're looking at very likely is an orphan who was produced by the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, which began to end, as we know, in 1812 and so on. So it turns out that over 1 million young Frenchmen died under Napoleon trying to conquer the world. And that means that there were many young people left without a father, and a great number of orphans and so on. If you look carefully in the background of this painting, you'll see that she's literally in a cemetery. And Delacroix was really making a point of calling our eyes to the fact that war is a very dicey and devastating activity. I worked as a psychiatric orderly during the Vietnam War, and I saw at firsthand what war can do to the minds and hearts. I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate wars. There have been, and there are many people who have sacrificed their lives for our behalf. I'm not talking about that. I'm just simply talking about those people who've had to enter into the battlefield are forever changed, and we need to owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, and I can tell you firsthand I've seen that. So what we see here is an image that is going to take us on a journey. I chose this image because she has often been considered a very romantic figure, but when you think about the reality that backs the painting, it starts to help us see that the word romantic doesn't necessarily mean it's cuddly and cute. It's often the fact that paintings that were produced by artists like Delacroix take us into some very interesting and sometimes very challenging places. Here are some of the topics I'm going to be covering today. We'll begin by looking at some of the work of Turner, J.M.W. Turner, the great painter, who found the ocean, the sea, to be a very sublime subject, vast, untamable, scary, beautiful, and romantic in a lot of different ways. Then we're going to talk about the legacy of rebellion, revolt, and renewal that occurred during the so-called Romantic period. We'll talk about someone like Napoleon. We'll talk about those who later revolted against his relatives who ended up in politics and very much involved in the life and time of France. We'll talk about the renewals that occurred during this time all over Europe and in the United States as well. We'll talk about the Gothic revival and renewal that came out of this time and place. Spiritual and medieval revival that was very much a part of the mindset of this period and why it began. We'll talk about transcendent spaces. We'll talk about travels to exotic places. We'll talk about the romance of childhood and daily life. The fact that Alice in Wonderland and many other books having to do with childhood and innocence were produced in the 19th century and continue to be produced in the 20th century. And then to bring this home, we'll talk about some contemporary examples of some works that have occurred in our own time and age. And it'll help us realize, hopefully, that we share a common heritage and that we continue to have a great need for so-called romantic subject matter. Here on the screen as well, you're looking at a painting by Caspar David Friedrich, an important German painter who painted Easter Morning. This painting was titled that, painted in 1835. He was a very religious man. He was also a very close friend of Goethe, the great German thinker, philosopher. And the title itself will alert you to the fact that it is a rather unusual theme. And all of us knowing about Easter morning and what it meant know that there were certain women who went to the tomb to discover that it was empty, according to the Gospels. And what we see are three ladies on a road, but they're wearing contemporary German clothing. And so the idea is that we could step into this experience in a way, rediscover something that happened centuries before. But the idea is that this legacy, the Christian legacy, and this hope in the resurrection was something very, very important to Caspar David Friedrich. And he produced many paintings that were highly popular. His work sold extremely well. And he brings into our own world in a way, something that seems far away. He brings it close to us. And that's part of the quest for the sublime, for the awesome, trying to re-enter history in some way and make it alive in some new way. So let me give you quickly some definitions right from some very important texts that have been written on the Romantic subject. It's always good to have a good grasp of some of the terminology of the period. And I won't be doing too much of this. I'll only give you a couple of quotes. But Mr. Vaughan, Dr. Vaughan, in his Romanticism in Art, produced a book that I think is extremely important for any of us who are interested in this subject. And using the word romantic to defend the free expression of imagination, there's already part of a definition right there. The free expression of imagination and association in the arts. Therefore, the Schlegels, early 19th century German literary critics and philosophers, had chosen their name with care. They chose this word romantic. They had taken a term that had already come to mean for academic theorists and admirers of classical art, those emotive extremes. There's another word that you can use to place in the context of romantic that lay well beyond the proper sphere of an artist to even depict, for instance, a vast ocean, trying to paint a rainbow, which you're going to see some artists try to do this. Very often the Romantic painters took on subjects that had never been painted before, and that itself was a quest. The word romantic, in fact, derived precisely from the kind of poetry that was felt to display such irregularities, the chivalric romances of the Middle Ages, King Arthur and the knights, etc. Since the Renaissance, the word had come to mean all that was wild and fantastic, that imagination which is most free, as one early commentator, the philosopher Henry Moore, had expressed it already in 1695. In the pictorial sphere of painting, the word had evolved from this to describe sights that excited the imagination and led to reverie. Ancient castles were only one kind of image to be noted for this kind of evocative quality. There's another descriptive term that we can use to get our hands around what romantic could mean. The quote, one could quote such examples as romantic branches of a giant oak, grotesque and romantic waterfalls, or wild and romantic mountains. Our own understanding of the word is similar enough for us to imagine, in most cases, what's meant in the 18th century and 19th century when the reference was made to a, quote, romantic scene. Turner produced this painting at the age of 25 in 1800, Dulbarton Castle. And he used this as an entry piece to be accepted in the Royal Academy in London, at which he became a president. And he held that presidency over 20 years. And Turner depicts here a subject that he could have easily read in a book by Schnelling, in a treatise that he wrote in 1796. Listen to this literary reference and see how well our friend Mr. Turner has brought it into being. The castle hovers above the town and dominates it completely, increasing the romanticness of the moment. In the background, the ruins resting in the dusky twilight. So we find that the artists and writers all were sharing a great deal of interest in the sublime and the sea and the mountains as well. And here's a photograph, photo of a painting of Turner at the age of 23. He's on his way to become a very great painter. And we see a young man here staring straight out at us, looking very earnest, looking like somebody who's not afraid of conquering parts of the world, which he will do. He was a very determined man. He had no fear of going out to sea. There are stories of him that were told by his colleagues of having himself strapped to a mast of a ship so he could see the waves crashing against the ship and so on, and almost being swept overboard. And this guy was not afraid to get out in the mix to really get an idea of what the sea was all about. His nickname in the little community in London where he lived was Captain Buggyboo, because he liked to stand on a precipice or cliff with a telescope looking out to sea, and the little kids in the neighborhood assumed that he was a sea captain, and so they didn't know his name. He wasn't always that communicative, so they nicknamed Captain Buggyboo, walking around with his telescope. But he was always studying the ocean to learn from it, and in this way he was someone who really understood what it was to paint the ocean. As a teacher, he painted these studies very likely in 1843, probably for his teachers, as I say. And look at the titles of these pictures. One's called Shade and Darkness, Deluge Evening. The other one's called Light and Color, Goethe's Theory, Deluge Morning. He was very familiar with Goethe, the great German writer's theory. And Goethe was someone who, of course, produced Goethe's Faust and other very important literary works that helped launch very imaginative writing within Germany and throughout Europe. Goethe was probably one of the most important charismatic individuals living through this time and had great ties to important writers, artists, etc. He's depicting something like a hurricane. In fact, when you look at these pictures, it's a deluge indeed, but he doesn't identify specifically what kind of deluge, but I identify it as a hurricane, something that we saw in the news quite a lot. And it has a very circular quality. Both of these pictures swirl. They give you a sense of someone who has probably been on a ship, really seeing the ocean crashing and all that. And he simplifies it. These pictures have a very intense almost ocularity about it, as though he's forcing us to see through our eyes. Both of these pictures swirl and have a curved quality, as though we could be looking through glasses at them in a way. And we also get the feeling that we're being swept into these pictures, into the activity of them. And these pictures had a big impact, believe it or not, well into the 20th century. The American painter Mark Rothko, who painted so-called abstractions, which in a way are simplified landscape cloudscapes, knew the work of Turner very well and admired it tremendously. Also, Claude Monet and the Impressionists loved Turner's work and felt that he was way ahead of his time, in a sense was already probably more than an impressionist. In a way, he was an expressionist, but he was also someone who was a naturalist in a curious way. He's a very difficult guy to identify. I like to show these images, which he produced in 1815. These are studies of reflecting metallic spheroids. And what you have in them are essentially anamorphic images, that is, images of an entire room that's been collapsed and that could be stretched out. And again, there's an ocular quality, a circular quality, very related to the paintings that I just showed you. He's a man who's not only interested in the paintings, but he's interested in vision and how it works. So he has a very scientific bend, and at the same time, when we think of him as a romantic artist, he's someone who's very interested in the mystery of human consciousness. That's something that's very important in OLLI, for instance, lifelong learning. What do we need to do to remain active lifelong? The mystery of memory, cognition, and so on. And so Turner's doing these amazing studies that are very unusual. He's interested in delving into unusual ways of even looking at the world and seeing it in a fresh way. And there's a sense of awesomeness about that, which is a part of the romantic quest to see more, to look more, to use the imagination to discover it. And Einstein was the gentleman who once said that without imagination, knowledge can only go so far. And Einstein knew a great deal about imagination and the power of it. In a curious way, we could even see someone as a great thinker as Einstein and many of the great theorists, scientific, also having very strong imaginative properties as well. And so we see some of that science and imagination in Turner in so many different ways. Now, when we turn to his paintings, we're going to see in 1815 he produced Carthage, which is entirely imaginative painting. There was no Carthage in 1815. He sees it as John Constable would have, in this beautiful liquid light, as a very quiet harbor with classical buildings and things like that, and some ships out in sea. It isn't our idea of Carthage at all. It looks more like some place maybe in London or beyond, with people wearing very beautiful clothes and things like that. But on the right, we see the burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, which happened in 1835. And he was able to observe this with his telescope and made numerous watercolors, and then he produced this large painting, which has to do really with the disaster. Really, when you think of the burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons in 1835, it was not unlike having our capital building in the United States kept on fire, or the Pentagon when it was hit with a plane and stuff like that. So we have a painting that has very strong political and emotive qualities for any British person. So we could say, in what way is it romantic? And so we have to just say that the term romantic embraces a large area of human experience that's often very difficult to fully grasp. When we had our experience with 9/11, we experienced things with planes crashing in buildings that we would never have imagined. And then we didn't have to imagine. That was the problem. We wish that we could have just imagined. And so when we think about those vast, horrific experiences, it stretches the human mind. It helps us realize that there are things in life that could occur that we could never have imagined or guessed at. And it's a cause for great concern. And so what Turner's doing is turning to a subject that probably made the Brits much more conscious of having some kind of regulation, law and order to prevent their key parliamentary buildings from being destroyed again. And in other parts in Europe, we have a French painter, his name was Lugenberg, who goes to Coalbrookdale, this is in England, where there was an enormous amount of iron and steel production already in 1801. And so it was a town that looks like it's on fire, and that's not the case at all. It was a city where the kilns and the furnaces and the production of all of these metals kept going on day and night. And it was destroying a lot of the streams and even the natural surroundings of this area. John Ruskin was very much aware of a lot of the manufacturing of steel, coal production, things of this nature, and began to write in a very critical way about the importance of preserving the natural landscape. He became a real activist for the preservation of natural resources already in the 1800s, and we often think that our concern here in the United States for streams and not over mining and all this kind of stuff is something new. It isn't. There have been thinkers throughout the time. And in a way, Ruskin is also a member of this imaginative school as well, because he's imagining clean streams. He's imagining what could happen if people don't stop destroying the natural surroundings. And keep in mind that this will be the age of Queen Victoria, where the imagination begins to imagine times where children aren't being maimed in factories and where humane societies will keep animals from being killed indiscriminately. It was the Victorian era that did the most for orphanages, welfare societies, and other things that make it much more common in our time. But we have to salute Albert and Victoria and so on for bringing this into being during the so-called Romantic period. Now, we're looking here at a painting by a gentleman named Jericho. He actually was a hussar. He was involved with the horse, we would say groups of armed soldiers and horses and so on. He died at the age of 32. We think that Van Gogh was young, dying at 37, but Jericho was also a gentleman who liked war and had been involved in what we now call extreme sport. Extreme sport. He liked to ride wild horses and things like this. So we see him on this horse, and it's very much like a self-portrait because he got to wear these kinds of cool costumes and risked his life doing stuff like this. And we have a quote here from Rousseau, who wrote something that we all remember probably pretty well. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One man thinks himself the master of others, but remains more of a slave than they are. So we're now looking at a period of rebellion, revolt, and renewal. We were looking just in the first few minutes, we were looking at painters like Turner, who started to depict things like burning House of Parliament and things like that, and we are now shifting in our definition, and our search for romanticism is now looking toward rebellion, revolt, and renewal. So let's see what this looks like. Well, we have Delacroix, who painted that picture I showed you at the very beginning of the little orphan in the cemetery. In 1830, he paints Liberty leading the people. And earlier in 1824, he had painted the Massacre at Chios. where we see what's essentially a kind of racial and ethnic cleansing, which did occur in places like Turkey and other places, in Algeria and Tunisia. He was very much aware of a lot of these atrocities that were occurring at this time. And then the student rebellions of the 1830s that were heralded in Les Miserables. Victor Hugo wrote about these. And by the way, our concept for our Statue of Liberty was very much inspired by this painting and other depictions of a woman who came to incarnate a culture or a country. So we see Lady Liberty raising the flag, and around her are all kinds of young guys, and one guy has a top hat and so on. He's probably a student, and a lot of people who've already died, and a young man, a young boy with some pistols running along, probably not going to be around for very long. People willing to die for freedom. Now, it's interesting because Delacroix wrote in his journal about actually observing these student rebellions and was, in a way, almost tempted to join them, but he decided, well, I think it's probably a better thing for me to observe from the sideline, and I'll make a nice painting of this. I'm not sure I want to die this afternoon. And I'm glad that he didn't, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure how much these students really achieved. But I did happen to have a personal experience of something like this in 1968 when I was in France during some student revolts, the Renault factory and stuff like that. And I remember seeing people throwing cobblestones at police and stuff like that. And I wanted to just get out of there. I was with some other American students, and we got caught up in a lot of the revolt of '68 with Eric the Red and all that stuff. It's very scary to get swept up into this kind of stuff. But it's romantic in the sense that we see a great deal of movement. It's romantic in the sense we see people risking life and death. And now we're starting to realize that romanticness can take us into some very scary places, sometimes places we'd rather not go. We also see that there can be a tendency in the romantic vision toward a kind of propagandistic view. For instance, we see Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard Pass in 1802. We know from historical records that Napoleon was actually quite sick with fever and was on a donkey and completely wrapped up in blankets and other things. He was not on a white horse, and he didn't have a big red sash. And it turns out that David was really a great painter who actually was a propagandist. So then students always ask me, Dr. Havlicek, do you think that a work of propaganda can be a great work of art? And I said, well, it looks to me like David was a great painter, and it looks to me like a lot of this is propagandistic, and it's great work. So what do you do with that? And so then we have to look at the word propaganda, and we realize that propaganda means to propagate some point of view. And there could be good and bad propaganda. It doesn't necessarily mean that propaganda is false. We can have a lot of good propaganda like freedom and democracy and other stuff. We can propagate that idea. And on the left, painted in 1784, when Napoleon's out recruiting young men to die for him as he wants to conquer the world. We've got the oath of the Horatii, these guys who are raising their hand and they're going to take on the sword and they're going to go heroically to conquer Egypt or someplace like that with Napoleon. And so very similar in World War I and World War II, we had posters in various places, what Uncle Sam calls you and stuff like that. And it looked pretty cool, pretty heroic. And I've always been completely enthralled with Marine outfits. And sometimes I'm still tempted to join the Marines, although I don't think they'll take me, because I love those uniforms so much. And I could almost be tempted to join them just to wear those uniforms. And so the French soldiers got to wear some really cool clothes before they got blown up, probably. And so we see imagery like this. And we had other artists who joined the project who continued to promote Napoleon in various ways. In 1823, well after the Napoleonic thing, there were still memories of him. And, you know, if you talk to French people, often they have some respect for Napoleon because the Napoleonic laws and so on set up some very good systems of civil government in France, even to this day. So I'm not going to completely knock this guy. He was a very brilliant man. But what we see here in the painting on the left, General Napoleon visiting the plague house at Jaffa, is again something that is a bit of fantasy. He actually abandoned his troops who were very sick at Jaffa, and he came back to Paris with a triumphal entrance into the city with some of the plunder of Egypt, while these guys stayed in this plague hospital and died. And what you see is something completely different. We see him there touching this guy as though he's healing him, as though he has some healing property. And then on the right, we see Napoleon returning to visit the wounded, and he's bending over this general whose leg has been amputated and stuff like that. So we get this very benign, kindly, concerned quality of Napoleon. And my own view is probably closer to the one in War and Peace that Tolstoy carefully documented when he talks about the Battle of Borodino, and he talks about Napoleon often looking with great pleasure over a battlefield and seeing all the people who died out there under his great project, his great wars. It's stuff like that. And you don't get such a kindly view at that point of the little corporal in this case. So we can also see that Romanticism can also be a kind of falsification as well. Now let's look at some of the people who created this movement. The first French painter to actually coin the word and use it in his own letters was Delacroix. We see a self-portrait here at 1837, and we also have a portrait of Lord Byron, who also died very young, 36. And so I often ask my students, I said, give me your bead on these dudes. How do you read them? And so let me ask you guys to look at these images for a moment. What's your take on Mr. Byron? Anybody? Okay, what do you read? Thoughtful, okay, all right. What else? What else? What's that? Tortured, okay. Thoughtful and tortured you can be thoughtfully tortured, I guess. All right, let's have some other comments. Introspective. We know him to be a great poet, right? Everybody know the poetry of Mr. Byron? You also know that he was into extreme sport. From all that we know, he actually contracted pneumonia by swimming in very icy rivers and things like that. We also know that he was not a guy you wanted to have around your wife too much. And because he was very guilty of seducing many ladies over his lifetime as well. He was a very handsome dude, kind of the Elvis Presley of his time with wild hair. And I think when you look at who painted this picture, it has a double meaning because it was painted by Jericho, whose work we were just looking at before, who was on the wild horse. And there's also references to him being thrown off of one of these wild horses and being severely injured and eventually dying from injuries suffered from extreme sport. And Mr. Byron was extreme sport as well. He wasn't the kind of guy who you're probably going to have a long-term relationship with, etc. Now, Mr. Delacroix, it's been thought, we have never proven this, that he was actually an illegitimate son of Talleyrand. And he has a very aristocratic quality, and he's left us some amazing journals. Delacroix's journals are extraordinary. For me, they're equal in some ways to Van Gogh's journals, which we used to write my book, which has many quotes in it. And I think I've always believed that for a writer, one of the most important things to do when you're talking about an artist is to let the artist speak. Rather than hoisting a conceptual framework on them from a historical view from art historians, you let them speak for themselves and let readers draw some of their own inferences. So we have two guys here who are both called Romanticists, who both were very much involved in the movement of the time. Delacroix was very aware of politics, which is why many of his paintings have to do with political situations. On the other hand, Byron's work, his poetic work, has much to do with the sort of introspective thoughtfulness, as someone said, or even the tortured quality of someone with strong passions, not always reining his passions in. So that's kind of what we've got here. We've got a passionate group of artists. Delacroix was a very passionate man as well, although he was able to harness it in. Now, when Delacroix wanted to find subject matter, he didn't have to go very far. He picked up Dante's Divine Comedy. We've got this visit of Dante and Virgil to the river Styx, and we see tortured souls biting this ship, and we see in the background flames and hellishness, and we see Dante really freaking out. He's holding up his hand. He has this red cover over his head, and we see Virgil there, and so on. They're entering purgatory and hell and paradiso, etc. But he's given us one of the most dramatic moments from the Divine Comedy, where they are swept into this swirling water and they're being overrun by all these tortured souls. It's as though we've gone into Byron's mind, and now we're starting to see what he might have been thinking about, the kinds of subjects that he was thinking. And the fact that Delacroix wants to take on a subject like this tells us that we are in the Romantic period. We're dealing with subject matter that almost never had been depicted before. That's why it's romantic, because it's as though he's taking the blinders off. Let's try some new stuff. Let's move into some areas that we've never been in before. We saw some of this in the 60s with a lot of the musicians, Janis Joplin and many others, who began producing song that we had never heard before. Even the voicing of someone like Janis we'd never heard before, or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the layering of sound, or the Beatles bringing in all kinds of exotic instruments from India and sitars and things like that. We have been through our own period of Romanticism, and the Beatles were a very romantic group. And the fact that John Lennon died fairly young, and Paul McCartney's still active, and but a little more stable, et cetera, et cetera. But we've seen what this looks like. We had it in America too, Woodstock. We could talk about that as a very romantic situation as well. Now I'm going to give you some statistics on this picture. This is an important one, and we can learn a great deal about it. First of all, it's painted by Jericho, the gentleman who died on the horses that I mentioned, who very much likely severely injured. The painting that we're looking at, painted in 1819, makes reference to a tremendous atrocity that occurred in 1816, only 3 years earlier. The French Navy frigate Medusa, on the way to a French colony in Senegal, ran aground on a sandbar. It was captained by an officer who hadn't sailed a ship for over 20 years. And due to a shortage of lifeboats, 150 people were set adrift on a huge raft. After 2 weeks, only 10 of them were still alive because they had to stay alive through cannibalism. This was a horrific thing. Now, what's interesting from our perspective is that something happened exactly 100 years earlier. See if you recognize this. On the 15th of April in 1912, 1,500 people died when the unsinkable Titanic ran aground in the Atlantic. One occurred in 1816, another in 1912, almost exactly 100 years difference, which is really interesting. But what is even more interesting is that on the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia wrecked off of the coast of Italy with a huge number of a huge pleasure trip boat was smashed there, and the captain abandoned that ship. So we've had a number of events that have happened, Titanic, Concordia, Medusa, where a captain, a leader, someone who should be saving people's lives, essentially abandons their job or is ill-prepared to govern or something like that, and we see the results of that. It also happened in 1781, and I'll make a reference to that too, because these are all ship situations that that affected artistic production. In 1781, the captain of a British ship, the Zong, ordered 133 slaves to be overthrown, alive, many of them, so that insurance payments could be collected. The British painter Turner recorded this event in a painting that was later exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1840. I'll show you that painting shortly, hoping that King Albert and Queen Victoria would see it and thus speed up the abolition of slavery. Turner wrote a poem about this event, and he entitled it "The Fallacy of Hope." Now, these people on this raft, painted by Jericho, are trying to signal down another ship way off in the distance. They never were captured. Eventually, the 10 people who did survive were found. They came back to France. And when the people heard the story, they felt very in tune with this, because Napoleon himself in 1816 had only shortly gone out of his position as emperor. And the people of France, having lost 1 million of their own citizens, identified as the people on this raft. That's why the painting itself became extremely popular, because it was identified with. How many of you have been to the Louvre and seen this picture? Yeah, it's a very large painting in the Louvre. It's probably 18 feet wide or something like that. Very large painting. And it's very hard not to get swept up into it. And that was the idea. It turned Jericho overnight into one of the most popular painters of his time. It's too bad he only lived to be 33, because he was producing something that really touched people. And there's where the imagination of the Romantic painter takes root, because he can move people very deeply through his artistic production, and that's exactly what Jericho did with this great painting. And I want to just suddenly shift gears and show you something in 1982 that was very similar in a curious way in America, the Vietnam Memorial. It too took the loss of almost 60,000 young people and brought it to bear. It brought it before all of our eyes as a reminder that there had been enormous loss in our country. And works like this have a quality that's called hedonic weight in the language of aesthetic. It means that an artist or a designer creates something that captures the moral and ethical feeling of a whole community and embodies it. The Statue of Liberty is an image that has a great hedonic weight. And it takes two words. It takes the word hedonism and links it to moral and ethical qualities, hedonic. And it doesn't mean that it's hedonistic. It means it takes the concept of beauty and links it to duty. Duty and beauty made palatable and understandable to someone who was trying to come to grips with the Vietnam Memorial and the Vietnam loss. When you see all of those names there, it makes those names come alive. It gives hedonic weight to something that really did occur. And that's exactly what this did as well. Not only were these real people who died, but it reminded the French of all of the young men, millions of them. It makes the Vietnam loss seem pretty minuscule, but no loss is ever minuscule. But it's also why the painting itself became so important. How are we doing on time, by the way? Yeah, it's only, okay, all right, so we're doing okay. We have to end around 2 o'clock, is that right? Yeah, we end at 2 o'clock, and I want to have some Q&A at the end, and I'm sure you'll have some questions. And so I'm waiting, and when we're further along here, if I'm really into something, either my wife or someone, Barry, will give me this gesture. So I haven't seen that yet. Okay, we're back to Turner. Turner in 1842 paints Burial at Sea. He calls it Peace, Burial at Sea. We don't know exactly what's going on. These look almost like steamships because we see steam coming off of these dark silhouettes in a shimmering water. It's hard to fully identify what's going on, but we get the feeling that there's something ponderous. Our imaginations are stirred up, which is very typical of so-called romantic work. But on the right, here's a reference to that event that I told you about in 1840, where the slavers were throwing over living people so that they could collect on the insurance when they got back. This really went ballistic when the lords of Parliament and so on, and Wilberforce and others were able to use this to really argue against slavery. The fact that these people were merchandising on the lives of people. And Turner painted it with the idea that it would be shown there in Parliament. And so we start to see that Turner, too, had political interests. He wanted to change the world in some way, in a similar way that Jericho, when he painted Raft and Medusa, wanted to do it, or when Maya Lin produced the Vietnam Memorial in 1982. It helped bring to an end, in at least some way, in some kind of reckoning, losses that had not been really addressed. And having participated in some way in the Vietnam situation, I understood the need for it. And I also understood the need for Ken Burns' recent Vietnam presentation on public television. How many of you saw Ken Burns' Vietnam project? I hope every one of you sees it. It was masterfully done. Really, really extraordinary. And in a curious way, we could look at Mr. Burns as someone who continues on the so-called romantic legacy of showing us and embodying us in hedonic weight, giving hedonic weight to things of importance. And of course, in Spain, wasn't only in France and Germany that this interest in the so-called romantic experience occurred. As you probably know, Spain was invaded by Napoleon. He got around. He got to Russia too, but that didn't seem to help him so much. It didn't seem to help Hitler very much to go to Russia in the winter. Not a smart thing to do. So therefore, he was someone who saw the extremes of the French Revolution. So in 1798, Goya produces a work called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." He's saying something about the imagination being unhinged. So he's even using the imagination to show us when reason isn't being reasonable. That's pretty interesting. Showing us how unreasonable so-called reason can be. It was very reasonable for Hitler to go to Russia, but it was not such a smart thing. And we see a procession of flagellants in 1819. These gentlemen who would whip themselves to the point of just being bloody messes, walking around in the public this way. And these strange occult practices of a kind of religious zeal gone amok. And so the sleep of reason produces monsters in every way. And so we see that Goya is fascinated by the human imagination, the light and the dark side of it, the diabolical and maybe even the redemptive. But Goya was someone who really saw the dark side. By the way, Goya suffered from severe deafness, just as Beethoven did. And Beethoven, of course, is one of the musicians that fall beautifully into this period. If I give you a list of some of the key romantic characters of this age, you'll start seeing how similar they were in many ways. In fact, let me give you a quick list of just a few people who fall well into this age in both poetry and play production and painting and so on. Beethoven, Victor Hugo, Edgar Allan Poe, Rousseau, Wordsworth later, Hawthorne, Herman Melville in the United States, Dickens, Turner, Constable, Goya, Delacroix, Jericho, Innes, Church, etc. Such a long list. And I would even put Van Gogh in it, even though he's coming in around 1853, he's born, but he's very much an advocate of the writings of Dickens, Van Gogh is, and Shakespeare. In fact, Van Gogh had all of the collected writings of both Shakespeare and Dickens and was one of the most widely read artists of this time and loved very much this powerful production of the spirit that is so much a part of the romantic sensibility. Now, to just sort of take a moment and look at some images that most people would probably pick as romantic in a more typical sense, we think of Gainsborough, who paints Mary, Duchess of Richmond, or this portrait of George Anthony, both of them painted toward the end of the 18th century, but moving toward the 19th, 1788 and 1796. We see a kind of a baby-faced looking gentleman here with a Napoleonic hat, jacket, buttons and so on, and a wild-looking kind of horse who's looking at him in a very kind of benign way. And this lady is probably doing pretty well financially. She's the wife of an estate. I don't think that she had to worry about who was going to iron her clothes that day and who was going to tend her hair, etc. I don't think she's washing a lot of dishes. And she's very likely married to a gentleman who isn't working, because it was not a gentleman's thing to do. If you were a true gentleman in Britain, what you did was you retire and then you have your own little kind of experiments and do things that you enjoy, but you never get your hands dirty, because that's a commoner's mentality. You need to be rich and you don't have a job, etc. And so we see imagery that would probably be more like what most people think of romantic paintings. But the truth is that Delacroix would have had no interest in this kind of subject matter, and I don't think Delacroix thought very much of Gainsborough anyway. He thought of them as being sold out. And Goya would not have had a lot of respect for this either, painting people in this fashionable clothes. His stuff is edgy. His stuff will challenge you. And so I just want you to realize that there is more than one take on romanticism, more than one way to look at it. And I'm not saying we can't enjoy these pictures. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that when you look at this broad sweep of so-called romantic period, it's hard to systematically say it's only one thing. But I will say that when you're looking at the work of Goya, you're probably getting closer to the real heart of it all, especially in etchings like this, The Way of Flying, 1820. Extraordinary work. And of course, it's purely imaginary, and he's basing it a lot on the drawings that of Leonardo da Vinci did of flying machines and things like that. It's a very Halloweenish kind of image, really. It's kind of a scary-looking guy in the front here with his dark eyes hovering over your house. Pretty scary, you know. And so here's a pure example of imagination. When we think of the Romantic period, we think of things that really start tapping into the imagination, the light or the dark side, both the benign and the occult, the scary. Another key guy for this period will be William Blake, the great British artist who in 1794 produced this watercolor called The Ancient of Days, and produced many other works as well, works of poetry. Here's a little vignette from Blake to signal we've got we're looking at someone who has a very rich, broad, imaginative activity. To see the world in a grain of sand, that's imaginative. Heaven in a wildflower, you have to be pretty imaginative to see that. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, that's pretty awesome. And eternity in an hour. And of some of his poetic work, you probably know The Rose, O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm who flies through the night in the howling storm, hath found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love doth thy life destroy. Kind of a scary poem. Or tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye hath famed thy fearful symmetry, and what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes, and so on and so forth. Or Wordsworth. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I grow older, let me die. For the child is the father of the man. And I could wish my days to be linked each to each by a band of natural piety. That's romantic poetry. That's romantic concept. And the idea of the child being the father of the man is a very imaginative notion. And this is something that Blake loved very much. And of course, we've got a lot of poetry of Blake, very powerful poetry. Now, during this time, there's also revival. Blake is a part of it. And where the Bible and archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land begin to produce a very powerful body of work, especially among the British painters, and some of the French as well. So we have Christ's entry into Jerusalem painted in 1846, falling right into this period. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think of a religious painting as a part of the Romantic, but it's in an exotic place, Jerusalem. The events of the New and the Old Testament really can spark the imagination. Even Bill O'Reilly wrote a book on killing Jesus, and it sold very well. And that encouraged him to write a lot of other books about killing people. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't read the books. I just don't like books with the title about killing people. I just don't like the idea of that, even if the books are very redemptive. So that's just me. Just me. But in any case, we have a painting that shows some archaeological research. The walls, the buildings, and all these kinds of things fit really well into a kind of mindset of trying to rediscover what the ancient world might have looked like. And now we're looking at the work of Holman Hunt. In 1853 and again in 1873, he produces a great number of paintings having to do with the life of Christ. Holman Hunt takes this so seriously that he moves to Israel and spends the last 20 to 25 years of his life doing archaeological digs and things like that in and around Jerusalem. And so we see here a painting on the right entitled Shadow of Death, and we see Jesus as a carpenter, essentially stretching, it seems like working in the carpenter shop, but what we get from that is a premonition, if you will, forecasting his crucifixion, and we see in the background his shadow basically on a cross. And above it, like a design or something, we see a star, that reference to the star of that's we read about, the star of that the shepherds saw, and so on. Or Light of the World, a very popular image that he produced, often reproduced in lithographs and things like that, of Christ knocking on the door of the heart with a lamp at night. And the idea is very clear. It has to do with redemption and calling for life change. And both of these pictures were very well respected among the pre-Raphaelites. There were a group of painters who included Dante Gabriel Rossetti and others, who painted pictures like this with great deal of attention to detail, highly detailed pictures. They were called pre-Raphaelites because they wanted to bring in some of the skill level of the Renaissance and before Raphael and up to Raphael. And when we think of revival, we often suddenly think of Turner, who paints this work of Westminster Abbey, the Gothic cathedral itself, and the Gothic revival that began in the 18th and 19th century and continued into America, even into the 1920s. The high school that I went to had Gothic arches, and it was built in 1923. And I was going there in the 1960s, and I thought, hey, that's cool. Look at these Gothic windows in this building. And that was in Iowa. And there were Gothic, so-called Gothic images and these schools and so on all over the place. We still have them. And so it's a part of a Gothic revival that affected American architecture and a lot of other things. Hollywood, if you drive around in the hills of Hollywood, there's a lot of interesting mission revival stuff as well that stars and other people lived in as well. That was also considered a kind of romantic movement. And here in Southern California, there was a revival of interest in the missions. Frank Miller, who was involved in the Mission Inn in Riverside, tried to recreate effectively a kind of mission. In fact, the St. Francis Atrio, the little church there, is essentially a kind of Gothic church to some degree. And then he brought Mexican imagery into it as well. And so this idea of revival was very much in the air at that time. Paul Gauguin, who painted this picture in 1898, at the end of his life was actually very much involved with religious studies. We have quite a lot of material that he was working on right up to the end of his life. He died in 1903, but in 1898 he painted this picture that has to do with big themes, we would say religious imagery, if you will. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Life and death is being dealt with here in a very profound way. He painted this picture thinking that he was dying, which he was. He had gangrene and other things. He did survive this, and it's now in the Boston Museum, this painting. And it too could be seen as a type of revival painting where an artist is turning to very important religious subject matter and looking at it from multiple points of view, if you will. Van Gogh himself, who was the son of a clergyman and had been a lay pastor, painted in 1898 The Starry Night, which is based on a passage from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, I believe. And I offer a whole chapter in my book on this subject. And let me show you why I believe that this was, in fact, inspired by a religious subject. Here's the passage. This is right out of Victor Hugo's chapter 2 of Les Miserables, published really and released in 1862, but he'd been working on it much earlier. If you go down a few lines, start here. He was there alone with himself, collected, tranquil, adoring, comparing the serenity of his own heart with the serenity of the skies, moved in the darkness by the visible splendors of the constellation, the invisible splendor of God, opening his soul to the thoughts which fall from the unknown. In such moments, offering up his heart at the hour when the flowers of night inhale their perfume. Watch this. Lighted like a lamp in the center of the starry night. His title came there. Expanding his soul in ecstasy in the midst of universal radiance of creation. He couldn't himself perhaps have told what was passing in his own mind. He felt something depart from him, something descend upon him, mysterious interchanges of the depths of the soul with the depths of the universe. And when you look at this picture, you see exactly that kind of thing. You see the heavens swirling down, clouds, stars, the earth seemingly writhing up, cypress tree writhing up like a flame, often in a graveyard, because these cypress trees were evergreen and a symbol of eternal life. In the center, you also have a church. So there's no question that there is religious subject matter here. In fact, Van Gogh, when he produced it, said, when I painted this, I had a terrible need for religion, but I didn't feel welcomed in the local church. And so I painted my night sky very much out of Hugo. And so I'm just sharing with you how this revival kind of mentality occurred, especially after difficult times in Europe. Transcendent landscapes too, and here we have a work by Caspar David Friedrich, painted in 1818. Landscapes are especially powerful, and here is what Goethe wrote in 1771. Goethe was a friend, by the way, of Caspar David Friedrich, the gentleman who painted this picture on the left. And very interesting, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich is almost always used as a front cover on books on Romanticism. Here's a guy in a frock coat with a very cool cane on a craggy mountain looking out into this amazing landscape. It's very difficult to see what's out there. That itself is very mysterious. And you could ask yourself, how could a guy dressed this beautifully end up in such a remote place? Good question. Maybe he was helicoptered in, but I don't think so. Not in 1818. So we'd have to use our imagination, and typical of Friedrich, he almost always shows us a profile from the back so that we can place ourselves into the viewer. We don't see a face, so we can easily imagine that we are the one. And his idea was to bring us into this imaginary realm. Listen to Goethe. And what's cool about this, I think, is how much the literary interest matched the visual. It's almost as though, literally, Friedrich is painting what Goethe describes. When the mist is rising in my dear valley around me, and the sun at its height does not shine into my woods impenetrable darkness, and only single rays steal into the holy place within. And I lie in the tall grass by the falling brook, and I feel the presence of the Almighty who created us in his own image, the breath of the all-loving one who bears and preserves us, soaring into eternal bliss, my friend. And I often think yearningly, oh, if you could express that, if you could express that on paper, what lives so abundantly and so warmly in you, so that it would be a mirror of your soul, as your soul is a mirror of the infinite God. Now that's a very profound notion. The idea of the human mind being a mirror of the universe was a German idea. Hegel, Schelling, and a number of very important, Goethe, many of them, especially in Germany, were fascinated by the idea of the human mind being a microcosm of the universe. It's a very interesting concept. The human mind is a very amazing thing. And we can see why they would think that. So the imagination is a way of tapping into the mind as a mirror. Here's another work by Caspar David Friedrich. And so the question always would be, where is the sun coming from? Is it there in the landscape, or is it possibly emanating from the heart of this woman? Woman in the Morning Sun, 1811. Again, it's a work that suggests somehow the human being can be a microcosm of the macrocosm. That's a very romantic view, very extraordinary. And again, there's Friedrich showing us the back view of someone so that in a sense we could identify with them. And of course, typical waterfalls, Niagara Falls, and a lot of other things are perfect subjects for romantic paintings, and ruins of Gothic buildings like this one. In fact, what was fascinating is that there was actually a house. This is really a real view. He really did see this. There was a house built in the ruins of these Gothic church that had been destroyed. You can see the little house there and people walking around and stuff like that. In fact, that'd be a pretty good place to live if you were going to have a hurricane, I'm thinking. Probably. Especially if the wind was coming, but maybe not. Who knows? I don't think you'd want a Gothic ruin falling on your house. But in any case, it has a wild, irregular quality that fits very well into this. Now, there's an artist named Runge who also lives a very short life. He lives to be 33. A lot of these guys live short lives, and they weren't all into extreme sport either. I don't know the circumstance of Runge and why he lived such a short life, but he was fascinated by the idea of the child and childhood being a particularly pure period in our own consciousness, and where our imaginations are, in a way, unformed. Remember that poem of Wordsworth, "For the child is the father of the man, and I could wish my days to link each to each by a bond of natural piety." That's what we're getting here. And of course, by the end of this century, we're going to have an enormous number of books having to do with childhood. Alice in the Wonderland and many other books that have to do with children will be produced during the 19th century, the Bronte sisters and so on. So many of the heroes of Dickens were young people. David Copperfield, right? A young man who has to make his way. Little Nell. Many of these stories have to do with young people who are isolated. Little Nell's an orphan, right? Everybody know Little Nell by by Dickens, Charles Dickens? No? Yeah, de Courcy. So this idea of the young, or the fact that we saw Delacroix painting an orphan, that's very much a part of the mentality. And often the children itself had to do with Victoria, who had a lot of children, and it made children very delightful. And the Victorians took great delight in their children because of Albert and Victoria and their example. And Turner of Cass, Captain Buggy Boo with his telescope and so on, he continued to produce these paintings, watercolors, many of them, building up into almost contemporary connection with our own time, so that many contemporary artists in our own lifetime, like Rothko and others, have looked at these watercolors and have imagined very lyrical paintings that would have qualities like this. And in America, we had Edwin Church, who decided to paint the Northern Lights in 1865. For those of you who are historians, what would 1865 signal to you about America? The end of the Civil War, exactly. Do you see why, after the Civil War, imagery like this would be very appealing? After all of the death and so on, having something to lift the spirit. And Church was the man to do it. He produced very uplifting scenes from nature to, in a way, cleanse the consciousness, to remind us of things that are sublime and beautiful in nature that give you a sense of awe in the face of it. Here's Church again. And if you want to see this painting, go to the De Young Museum in San Francisco and you'll see it. It's right there. Spectacular painting of a rainbow. Landscape with rainbow. And remember what I told you at the beginning? Part of the Romantic project was to even try to paint subjects that were almost impossible to paint. To paint a convincing luminous rainbow is almost impossible. And Church pulled it off. Multiple times. Very, very strange, amazing to try it. And the American painters were some of the most ambitious of all, of trying to paint the most unusual subjects. So, American ingenuity at it again. It was tried in 1655 by Rysdale, and you consider a painting like this in a way romantic too. And I'm not going to say that romanticness is a part of any one century, although I would say that you can see the most of it in the 19th century. But you'll see qualities of it in Dutch painting too. Here we have the Jewish cemetery, and there was a rainbow that was very brilliantly painted there on the left side. It's, the pigment, for some reason, has become transparent and pretty much disappeared, and it looks just as though it were white. But originally it was multicolored, like Church's rainbow. And you get the feeling that the tombs in this cemetery are breaking open, and that there's a kind of resurrection. The idea of life and death coming together, revitalization. And the rainbow is linked, of course, to the Old Testament. We first read about it in Scripture with Noah's flood. At the end of Noah's flood, the rainbow appears in the sky, and it becomes a covenant symbol, signification that the earth will never again be destroyed by a deluge of water when you see the rainbow of the sky, etc. And so the Dutch, who were very much a people of the Word, of Scripture, knew this. And they also realized that the rainbow itself could signify eternal life, just as it was for Noah. Now, Caspar David Friedrich had a more ominous side to his own life. When he was around 14, his own brother had crashed through the ice when they were ice skating. His brother was 18, and Caspar was trying to pull his brother out of the ice and couldn't. His brother died. And it was interesting that throughout his life, he would sometimes return to the ice. And this a painting called Sea of Ice, Arctic Shipwreck in 1824, or Cross Beside the Baltic at 1815. Both of them use, in fact, particularly the one on the right, overtly religious Christian symbolism to signify eternal life and a victory over death. And I think the painting on the left also with the shipwreck, there are some very deep feelings that he had about the loss of his brother, but I think he, in a way, resolved it with some of the more overtly redemptive imagery that he used too. That's part of this awesome spectacle. Exotic places, I'll quickly go through this, but it turns out that Delacroix himself began traveling a great deal to places like Corsica and others and began painting so-called exotic subjects, especially people with turbans and clothing of Moorish clothing and Turkish carpets and so on. This was very popular throughout the entire 19th century, and in America, for instance, we had a lot of artists' work that was being produced, like Arthur Bridgman, who was an American. He too went to exotic places and produced these scenes in Algeria and so on. Bric-a-brac was a part of the 19th century. A lot of people would have swords on their walls and stuff like that from places like that. So there was a lingering interest in this. Jerome in 1870 produces this painting called The Snake Charmer. It's a part of this romantic theme of going to exotic places. And even Tadema or Tadema, you can pronounce it either way, the great Dutch painter, he in 1885, in 1866, produces for years these extraordinary paintings of life in Rome, the triumph of Titus and things like that, with very well-researched archaeological elements, everything, the chairs, the sarcophagi, all the details, everything about these pictures is quite accurate. And in Italy, we have scenes that we would probably identify as romantic, especially the kiss, 1859, or Sicilian Vespers, where we see this guy with his sword and all that kind of stuff. And this kind of fits well into this medievalism. Robin Hood, the interest in the Knights of the Round Table, all that was very important, powerful imagery during the 19th century, continued right into sometimes into the 20th. A lot of people did travel to places like Egypt and other things. I'm watching time because I want to have 10 minutes to chat to you at the end. So we've got about 6 more minutes. We can do it. And we have this person here, Fuseli, who is an artist. He goes to Rome. He sees the remnants, the remains of the great statue of Constantine, and these fragments. You can still see this stuff even now. And so the idea of large exotic shapes and imagery, that stretches the imaginations and so on. And Turner, in 1840, goes to Venice and produces these just dazzling paintings. These aren't, it's nothing to do with slave owners, it's just to do these extraordinarily beautiful paintings that are marketable. He wants to earn a living too, and he does really well by knocking these pictures out in great numbers, paying the bills. And of course, there's the romanticizing of the commonplace, and the great Novalis, the German writer, wrote in 1799 that one of the great things to do for an artist would be to take common things and do it in a very uncommon way, romanticizing them. He writes in 1799, insofar as to give the commonplace a lofty meaning, to the ordinary and occult aspect, to the well-known, the dignity of the unknown, I'm romanticizing them. And we see a good example of that in 1864 with this painting of this lady with her little mother, probably, or sister, reading to the little child, and the themes of the child being a time of afternoon dreaming, to have the innocence and the escape into childhood. That is too a romantic journey of sorts. And then you have people like Bouguereau, who paints Little Knitters or the Bohemian in 1890. These are basically street people, and these girls look like they're getting a nice bath every day and their hair's being washed, etc., when in fact they are very much likely to have been in very dire circumstances, let me just put it that way. And yet he can romanticize them in this way, creating fictions out of things that are not so funny. And of course, with the life of Victoria and Albert, they're enjoying their family life. There were many artists who began to depict the Earl of Cardigan, for instance, and making family life itself, and telling the family about their war episodes and all that kind of stuff. The subject of painting, or The Woman with the Mirror in 1854, this beautiful painting showing the interior, and in a way romanticizing marriage and romanticizing everyday life. The Kindred Spirits, the traders descending on the Missouri River by Bingham in 1845. It's of the ilk of Mark Twain. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, well before it. And this romantic, ordinary life of these fur traders ascending and descending the rivers of America. That too does it. Or Durand showing these kindred spirits in 1849, looking at the American wilderness that's about to be conquered, and all of the trees chopped down and people building log cabins and all that kind of stuff. It shows America manifest destiny in a way as a kind of journey toward this. Or boat building near Flatford Mill, where even the builder of this boat, there's something very romantic about it. I'd like to join him with some tools and smack away with that big hammer and help him build that boat. I'd love to work with him on that. That'd be very cool. You know, any guy who likes tools would like to get in there and start working on that boat, sandpapering it and making sure it floats, and that kind of stuff. So everyday life, even the idea of building a ship can become a subject of romantic work. And Van Gogh, too, always wanted a life and family. And he makes this picture. He makes a copy of a print entitled "The Man is at Sea," with this lady with her mother holding a little baby by a fireside. And Van Gogh identified completely with this, always wanting a wife and family. He's in his letters constantly talking about that. And we have a reference here from our book as well, where you can read about the romantic extremes of Van Gogh and the way that he somehow made at least some peace with this. That's part of the great story of Van Gogh. And in France, there was a very anti-clerical feeling. One of the great writers of the time said, "I dare not drive a car in Paris. The desire of running over a priest or bishop would be just too great for me." And it turns out that after the French Revolution, the French were extremely anti-clerical. And so they made these pictures of jaded-looking cardinals in these amazingly auspicious, sumptuous places, having their little glass of sherry and dipping bonbons into it and chatting away. And when the people were dying on the streets. So it's no advocation of this kind of lifestyle. In fact, it's just the reverse. And there's Captain Buggy Boo himself in 1846. He had some strange habits of actually working on paintings even after everybody else installed their work. He wasn't to be stopped. He was a very romantic guy, even in his behavior in many ways. And in our own way, in our own backyard, with The Lord of the Rings producing in 2001, the same year we had 9/11, that horrible massacre in our country, etc., one of the most romantic films of our time. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was produced, and we see here the elves, very romantic looking imagery, or these characters dressed in medieval clothing like a revival, heroic, willing to risk their lives to undo an evil. That becomes a part of a romantic quest. And when you think of images like this, and I don't do this lightly, these images of Iwo Jima, these gentlemen who really risked their lives in an amazing fact that this really was based on a real photograph in a beautiful pyramid, it has some of that quality too. We're reminded that there is indeed heroes within us, and that is a part of the romantic quest. So we're right on time. We have 10 minutes, and we'll just leave this up and take Q&A. Q&A. I've been on kind of a roll. Yes, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. Why? He wanted to have a family. Why didn't he? He was a very intense gentleman. He didn't often have a job. And I think most people didn't want to get married to him because he couldn't support them. He proposed a couple of times and was rejected. And so he had a very romantic notion that if the woman loves me enough, she'll be willing to live in poverty. And I love my wife. I don't know that she would willingly want to live in poverty if she had a choice, and that's part of it. But read the book, you'll find out. Okay, what else? What else? Some other comments, anything? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Would you comment on the Da Vinci painting at $450 million if it's not authenticated yet?
I think it's pretty well authenticated. It has been authenticated. I'm not sure that someone's going to spend $450 million on a guess. There's good documentation of this picture and a lot of other things. There have been other Da Vinci's that were discovered in the last probably 10 years. No one's going to buy a painting that doesn't have what's called provenance, references to it in private ownership, letters, and things of that nature. And as far as I know, it's well documented. I just read about it in the Wall Street Journal this morning, but I want to read more. So keep your ears open for it, and I think we're going to see this documentation very shortly. But it's called Christ, the Savior of the World by Leonardo da Vinci. Yeah, it was a painting that was heavily restored. It was off the radar screen. It was sold for like $125, about American currency, many years ago, because people kept painting over it. And then it was cleaned and realized that underneath was this magnificent Da Vinci. And it's not that difficult to authenticate a Da Vinci. There's very particular ways that he handled the pigment, very particular canvas that he used, and many other things that can be tested, and also documents. We know that that painting was painted certainly by Da Vinci, at least I believe so, because no one's going to spend $450 million without any basis. There was also another painting of Da Vinci rediscovered about 15 years ago. And a gentleman bought that for $20,000, which is a pretty good sum of money. And he auctioned that puppy off for around maybe 70 million. Not a bad investment. wasn't bad. But you take a risk. I mean, even at $20,000, it's still a lot of money if it doesn't go well, at least for me, maybe not for everyone else. Other questions? Any comments? Anything? Is that it? Yeah? Yeah, yes. Well,
it has been thrilling to,
thank you.
to share your knowledge.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
You were also very thorough.
Well, thank you.
Very thorough.
Thank you. I'm a child of a very thorough father. I'm glad I survived, you know. I survived my father. May he rest in peace. I love the guy, but he was not the easiest father to have.
I'm sorry you had to rush through the last half of that, because the first half where you had time to go into more detail was
Yeah.
really great.
Yesterday I did this talk in Marcus. I had 2 hours.
Yeah.
So I had to collapse it. So, but you guys are quick and easy, so you had no trouble.
Thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.